Yeah, actually, we can look at your hometown, D.C., for an example of what might happen if the court strikes down New York's law, because D.C. is where the circuit split happened, because the D.C. circuit struck down D.C.'s May issue law a few years back. Well, initially, D.C. had a total ban on all gun carry, as it's wont to do. It likes to be out on a limb, as strict as it possibly can be on gun issues, gun laws. So it had a total ban that got struck down. Actually, for a few days in D.C., they had permitless carry effectively, because their law against concealed carry or any kind of carry had been struck down and wasn't being enforced. So you were able to carry very briefly during that time period in D.C. without a permit, which I actually did. At the time.
I remember you tweeting that you were doing that.
Yes. So, no one was harmed in the making of that video where I briefly carried without a permit in DC. But then DC passed a May issue law, very similar to what, not so much New York. New York has kind of a weird variant on this basic idea of May issue, because usually in New York, they'll issue you a gun carry permit, but most of them effectively have restrictions that make it impossible to carry in the vast majority of public places. And so that's more how their law works compared to, California or Maryland, where they just won't give you a permit at all. And so DC passed a law like that. And then that got challenged and struck down in Wren as well. And so DC eventually got, I guess, the message here, which is that the courts were not going to allow them to, at least the DC Circuit wasn't going to allow them to have that style of law.
I mean, DC is a good example of what we're talking about, really. I mean, DC is a city whose constituents have suffered a lot from gun violence over the years. When I was growing up there in the 90s, obviously, 80s and 90s, it was a huge issue. And so gun restrictions are very popular. And the city council is responsive to that. And there's been, obviously there's been a rise in homicides that has happened over the past year, which I think, if I were to hazard a guess, my big theory is that people are at home and drinking and then acting recklessly. If I had to hazard a guess for why that's happening, because it seems to be uniform throughout the country. Right. But in DC, people who have not previously had experiences with seeing a shooting in public have seen them. And so I think that puts a lot, there's a lot of political pressure for city officials to do something when things like that start happening. Sure.
But so DC eventually passed the shall issue law, which they have now. Yeah. Now, it's a fairly restrictive version of shall issue. So shall issue is where effectively the government officials' personal judgment is taken out of the process. And so long as you go through the steps required to obtain a permit, you will be granted one. So if you pass the background check, you take the training that's required, they have to give you a permit. They shall issue you a permit instead of they may issue you.
How many people actually do that? Do you know?
In DC, there's, I believe it's a couple thousand at this point. They've issued a bunch more in recent years, probably in part due to some of the rising violence we've seen over the last year and a half. I know there's just a report out recently about how there was a significant increase in the number of permits issued in the city. I'm actually not aware of a single example of somebody with a permit committing any sort of crime. Not that is obviously there are people who have concealed carry permits in America who commit crimes, although from data from I believe Florida and Texas, which released their all of the crimes committed by anyone who has a concealed carry permit, they tend to be people who commit crimes at a lower rate than police officers do. And a much lower rate than the general public. As you might imagine, for somebody who's going to go through the process to get a permit to carry a gun, they will tend to be more law-abiding by nature, I would guess.
That's also, it would seem not to be very wise to commit, if you're going to commit a felony, to commit it with your government license issued firearm seems like a very unwise approach.
Sure. But so, we have seen sort of a real world example of what you were wondering about, like what would happen in New York if this goes through. And it, probably would see DC style shall issue laws get passed in, the remaining places that still have may issue, which, to be fair, it's only 8 states, but those 8 states are some of the largest states. So they make up about 25% of the population, California, New York, New Jersey. And so it still would be a fairly significant thing to have this happen. But you probably see quite a lot more Americans by, raw number obtain concealed carry permits